I am Doomsvince, and this is day 182 of Spawn Year.
Today, the last thing I would have ever expected happened, besides pizza delivery or waking up in my own bed. I was suddenly pelted by 151 Spawn trading cards, which shot up out of the open grave. Wow, Doomsvince, would it have killed you to invest in a rubber band or two? So after a leisurely game of 151 card pickup, I began to examine the cards. An unusual oblong shape for trading cards, but at first glance, they didn't seem like anything special or out of the ordinary. Picture on one side, some biographical information on the back. Nice and glossy, heavy, quality cardstock, and quickly flipping through a handful, I noticed a nice variety of artistic styles, when I might have expected the colossal laziness from the reprinted panels on the cards in the board game. These are done by a diverse assortment of artists, with a broad range of ultra-stylized, polished, and detailed to minimalistic, rough, and sketchy. And very, very few pictures are borrowed directly from the comic books. Nearly all of this art is brand new, for 1995. I made all these observations examining the cards out of pure curiosity. A lot of this random cash-in commercial paraphernalia has been ejected out of the open grave and onto my lap. That's how I wound up with this unreasonable plethora of action figures, the only people-shaped, well, for the most part, objects I've had to keep me company this whole time, besides the occasional visit from Doomsvince's colorless, enormous floating head, which hasn't graced me with its presence in so long, I'd start to feel like a prisoner whose jailer has forgotten him and left him to rot, if it weren't for the fact that Spawn-related literature continues presenting itself for review every day, and then I'm positive Doomsvince is behind Violator's constant yakking. I haven't heard his voice since I trapped him under that 2-liter in the Black Abyss, and I'm all out of Violator figures. Doomsvince could have replaced him if he wanted to, so I just have to assume he got sick of the joke. I know I did. I'm glad to know my days of talking to voices in my head are over. So after the never-ending onslaught of Spawn stuff, I was sure these cards weren't my subject for review today. They're trading cards. What could I possibly write about them? But as the day wore on, no new Spawn comic graced me with its presence, and I was, figuratively, running out of daylight. I wasn't going to let myself get buried 12 feet under over stupid cards, so I studied them closer and planned to try to come up with some fluffy BS to get me through this review, on the increasingly likely chance that that cardboard explosion was all the action I was going to see in this graveyard today. Yep, never a dull moment in Spawn Year. It's enough to make a guy miss weather. This set was a walk down memory lane, 150 artistic interpretations of events and characters from the first 27 issues of Spawn, plus a checklist, you know, in case I misplaced one of those cards that flew all over the place, with an angsty headshot of a young Todd McFarlane. This is the oldest item I've had to cover in a long while. Most of the recent material has been around 1999 to 2001. Good old simple 1995. The Casper the Friendly Ghost movie, Friends, Xena Warrior Princess, Toy Story. I don't know why we're back to that year, except that perhaps Doomsvince is kindly giving me a little refresher to jog my memory, because it feels like it's been eons since Spawn Year had much at all to do with Spawn. And honestly, I sort of appreciated it. It was nice to relive some of those early days of Spawn Year when I still gave McFarlane the benefit of the doubt, when I had faith the sloth-like pacing and meandering narrative were just growing pains. There's a lot of head-scratching moments, stupid ideas, pointless and outright abandoned premises, but some of my favorite ideas and stories are in those first 27 issues. Billy Kincaid, anti-Spawn, and especially that great moment when Spawn finally quits sulking and definitively chooses to be a hero, represented by his standing perfectly still as a car smashes into him. The card makes it even better by calling it Spontaneous Impact. Wish I'd come up with that. Not only was it refreshing to remind myself that there have been plenty of things I've really enjoyed in what eventually became a skull-crushingly frustrating comic book, but these cards make a lot of it better by condensing the story, cutting out a lot of what makes Spawn often unlikable, and presenting a lot of these ideas in a way that makes a reader imagine a far more competently planned and executed serialized narrative. Starting from card 1, it quickly becomes evident that each subsequent card is directly informed by the last, and that, read in succession, these aren't a bunch of disconnected biographies or dossiers, but a more or less coherent narrative, serving basically as the cliff notes for those 27 issues. On the back, you can track which issue the information comes from for reference, and unfortunately, the more superfluous issues that add nothing to the main story, like the political satire of the comics industry in issue 10, are all included. The cards work harder to integrate things like that into the greater whole than the book did, but they still bog things down. Still, I imagine a reader interested in the gist of Spawn, his adventures, and his supporting cast would find this largely readable without the books, and could retain a lot of the story without so much of the excess brooding, whining, narration, news anchors, though there's one card for that, and blood and gore, which is minimal in comparison. I wouldn't usually expect to recommend synopsis over the real thing, but these make Spawn seem fun and dynamic, and it's all infused with a general tongue-in-cheek quirkiness, whereas the book was sometimes that way, but often took itself way too seriously for the sorts of storytelling it was doing. No writer is credited for the text on these, which is a shame. The language is often colorful, it has a dynamic narrative voice with some great word choice, and sometimes creates surprisingly evocative imagery. On card 3, Sam finds one of Violator's victims, and the writer gives us, Sam isn't heartless, but the victim's body is. It's not bad. I'm positive it's not McFarlane writing these. This guy leaves out all of Spawn's incessant screaming and makes it seem like he and the alley bums are real friends looking out for each other. None of the actual events are altered, but he words them in such a way that Spawn's intellect, cunning, and likability are spared for the uninitiated. For example, on card 54, where are you? Oh, there it is. Talking about events in issue 9, we aren't told that Spawn idiotically pushed a button on an alien, otherworldly staff he knew nothing about out of simian-level curiosity, with Cog screaming behind him not to do it. It simply reads, he checks over her lance with disastrous consequences. That doesn't sound so gullible and infantile. Sure, it's all summation, but I think this writer is wisely choosing the right details to leave out, illustrating that if Spawn just acted more and said less, he'd be that much more compelling. But whoever wrote this couldn't resist the classic. This is Spawn territory! There's some odd terminology that crops up here. Since when is Bobby referred to as Uncle Bobby? I don't remember that. Like in the SNES game, Hell is referred to as the Darklands, even by people who don't know for sure if it exists. Weird censorship, given the dismemberment and discussion of a child killer. The issue 27 cutoff is fascinatingly awkward, because the author makes incorrect assumptions based on things McFarlane hasn't had a chance to retcon yet, but changes other things which I guess he has already planned to retcon. It's still Psychoplasm and not Necroplasm, but Anti-Spawn is called Redeemer, even though this is before the name change. On card 122, the narrator wonders what Wynn's men would think if they knew he was really Redeemer, like Wynn has a secret identity after the angels pour on more elemental fire. This guy has no idea McFarlane has already abandoned that idea. I guess he forgot to read the letters pages. The weirdest thing is that Chappell is talked about, beaten up by Spawn, said to be his killer, even gets the skull face, but is never drawn on a card or referred to as anything but the killer. Makes those cards really dull to look at. I don't know how this could have anything to do with McFarlane losing the rights to Rob Liefeld, given that the likeness and names were used on the animated series as late as 1998. Sometimes the pictures have nothing to do with the text, and those are almost always McFarlane drawings from the book, like they couldn't find artists for those, so they picked a substitute that barely applies. And doesn't at all if you're like me and you know where they came from. I guess they also couldn't use Cerebus. On card 59, a panel from a far later issue of Spawn and Wanda is used, while the text refers to an animal guide. But then, Spawn throwing his make-believe kid again more than makes up for it. I've always wondered, though, why in his perfect world, he imagines his daughter is white, when not only are he and his wife black, but he preferred being a charred corpse to appearing as a white person himself. Regarding the pictures again, I loved seeing so many greats do their take on the character. Artists I never thought I'd see do Spawn. Tim Sale, Jai Lee, George Perez, Jerry Ordway, and even one by Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti. I've got to say, this was a real treat. If Doomsvince would ever show his ugly mug again, I'd even thank him for it. Signed, Captain Logan.